Hi, this lecture is about interdependence. So we'll go straight to the slides this time. And part of the sort of relevance of this is that, interdependence, it's something that we talk about a lot these days, especially, right? But sometimes we think that, I think sometimes students might think that this is a fairly new concept, interdependence, right? That it comes in maybe after the fall of the Cold War, after sort of the end of the Soviet Union, and now we've got this sort of moment where the United States is the only remaining superpower. The world is getting closer together, borders are moving, we have like the internet, right? That's something that I sometimes will hear students talk about. Oh, we have the internet now, it's sort of changed the world, and certainly has revolutionized communications, and not only that, trade across borders, travel across borders, everything's becoming much easier, much faster. We have access to things that we didn't have access to before. And so perhaps that's increased and intensified interdependence in some ways. But perhaps it hasn't as well. And that's what I'd like you to be thinking about now. I'd like you to be open to that possibility. Maybe two possibilities. One, that interdependence has been around for quite a long time as a concept, at least since 1977. I'm taking this from Cohen and Nye from their book published in 1977. So quite some time now. What are we at? 50 years, 25, 50 years, 45 or 50 years. Also, let's be a bit more specific about what independence is, because Cohen and Nye want to be quite specific about it. They want to disentangle it from some of the other things that are out there, and so that sort of perhaps look the same and perhaps a part of the same sort of phenomenon, but interdependence for them has a very specific term. Now, again, this is still part of liberalism, right? And so we can look at Cohen and Nye as two sort of early liberals, and probably the best term, or the term that you often hear associated with these authors, is neoliberals. We talked a lot about neo-realists. These are the neoliberals, and I'd say for the neoliberals, part of what makes them neo is, well, you can't just call them, maybe to call them liberals is, although that does happen. But maybe at the beginning, neoliberals, in that they want to distinguish themselves perhaps from, perhaps from like early liberal thinkers like Kant, who we talked about in the last lecture, and Schumpeter and those guys. What they want to do is they want to take realism seriously. They want to take neorealism in particular seriously, and they want to talk to neorealist theorists of international politics, and on the same terms that neorealists talk. So that's possibly another reason why we call them neoliberals. And here they come along here, Cohen and Nye in 1977. Again, like liberals, we said last time in sort of our introduction to liberals, part of the thing that we're trying to do here is like figure out why is there no more war? And this idea of interdependence is getting quite popular at the time, and as an explanation perhaps as to why there's no war, right? States are sort of connected to a degree where they're, it sort of leads to peace, right? Because we can't go to war with anybody because we're all too connected. Incidentally, I mean, this has relevance for today as well. I'm sometimes hesitant to talk about current affairs, right? Because these lectures might serve for 2 or 3 or more years, perhaps. But I'm making them in 2022. And at the moment, and obviously, if you're in this class right now, then you're seeing this, right? At the moment, what's happening, right, is that we have this standoff between the United States and Russia over Ukraine, and one of the things that is talked about is interdependence, and sort of the threat that the United States is making is, hey, we will put sanctions on Russia, right? If you invade Ukraine, right, we'll apply severe sanctions, right? At least that's what they're publicly saying. So that's a possibility. And part of the idea there is like the reason why these sanctions work is that the United States controls some of the levers that link Russia into the world, right? One of them is the sort of the clearing system that banks use to clear payments. It's a worldwide system, and the United States apparently can threaten and sort of have threatened Russia with perhaps kicking them out of that. And so now their banking transactions are not going to be cleared in the way that everybody else's banking transactions are cleared. And so that's going to cause issues, and it's going to be roadblocks in terms of international trade and sending money across borders, which is supposed to deter Russia. And so, interdependence, it's very much a part of international politics today. And so, but it's a concept that's been around for a long time, at least 1977, but before that, because they're writing about it happening before that. What they do is they set up this sort of polarity right here between traditionalists on the one hand and modernists on the other hand. And they, of course, this is a very good tactic if you're ever going to write a book, right? You've got, these guys on this hand and these guys on the other hand, and you're in the middle, right? You're sort of resolving this conflict between the two sides. And so the two sides that they talk about in the book are the first side, they call them the traditionalists. They're really realists is really what they are. So you have these traditionalists, and they're insisting that the important thing is the balance of power, and it's a war of all against all. Right? So you can identify them. I mean, even if they don't use the term realist, they use the word traditionalist. You can identify that they really mean the realists, right? Because we've just been talking about the realists. And so there's those guys, and then the modernists, they're the other extreme, right? And we haven't talked about modernists mostly because they only exist inside of Cohen and Nye's book, but we're talking about them now, I guess. And so for them, the modernists are those who talk about, the world has changed. Nation states are not what they used to be. We're too interconnected to have a war. The reason why there's no fighting is because we're interconnected, right? Notice interconnected and interdependent. Those are different words, and Cohen and Nye are going to use them. They're going to exploit that difference, right? And they're going to really solidify that difference in their book, and we'll see that in the lecture. So here they are, traditionalists and modernists. The modernists are like, hey, nation states are finished. It's all about multinational corporations now. States are too intertwined to really take any decisive action. And anyway, they don't have the power anymore. It's the multinational corporations that have the power. So they're saying, look, of course, Cohen and I are going to say both of these guys are wrong, right? But the real truth is somewhere in between these two, and we're going to give you the real truth. And so here we go. They talk, secondly, they say, okay, these traditionalists, they sort of invented this thing called national security. Right? And there's this thing called the national security, and it's a rhetoric that's used by traditionalists, and sort of supported by realist scholarship. And, we've been afraid, right? It's now 1977, but since the Second World War, we've been afraid of this sort of all-out war between the Soviet Union and the USA, like a nuclear war. And so now anything that they say has to do with national security, what we understand is, yeah, we better listen to them, and we better maybe take into account what they're saying, because otherwise we're going to get in a nuclear war and everybody's going to die. So it's been quite powerful, let's say, right? It's used by US presidents. They say, look, we have this thing, we've just invented this thing called the National Security Council, right? Where, it's all, the very name connected to this idea of the national security thing. It says actually, like, the more and more we use this, the more and more we're getting into trouble. Things are starting to decline. And it's been misused, right? It was misused by Nixon and Watergate. We're sort of overusing it now, and so part of the, in terms of things starting to decline, part of it is that, the more we talk about national security, the sort of less power it has, right? Somebody says this is an issue of national security, and then nobody dies, and people start to say, okay, well, is national security ever such a life and death thing? Anyway, the other thing that's happening, right, in the 70s is we have this détente now with Russia and China, particularly with the Soviet Union, but also we're sort of resetting relations with China. And so again, and I covered this on the last video, right, but the geostrategic environment is becoming such in the 1970s that people are wondering, why is there no war? Things don't look like they're heading towards war. It looks like we're sort of heading towards coexistence and peaceful coexistence. So this national security rhetoric, it's sort of becoming out of place and a little bit old and sort of tired. And it's being replaced by this interdependence rhetoric. But again, right, this interdependence rhetoric is also wrong, right? But they say, look, interdependence rhetoric, it says that cooperation alone holds the answer to the world's problems. You know, and it also justifies the US leadership in world affairs. So it's like, okay, well, what, everyone's connected. You know, we can't, the United States has to be involved. It has to be involved in the world. And so Cohen and I think, you know, the United States are spending resources and they're exerting themselves across the world. And, you know, the thing that justifies that is, you know, that we're interdependent, right? We have this interdependence. We can't just leave everybody alone because it affects us as well. You know, and also because of that, we have to check threats from abroad. So we have to be involved in world security because of interdependence. And so they say this is the sort of rhetoric that's taken over the national security rhetoric is sort of tired and a little bit out of place. And so we've replaced it with this interdependence rhetoric. But again, it's sort of a justification of US acts and what the United States wants to do in the world. One of the parts of the interdependence rhetoric, they say, is like this idea of like the survival of the human race being threatened by environmental as well as military dangers, right? So, you know, sometimes we're inclined to think that the sort of environmental issues, maybe they start with Kyoto or the Paris climate change accords, and that they're a relatively new phenomenon or concept in international politics, but actually, they've been going on. This sort of environmentalist rhetoric has been involved in international and global politics for a long time. And so, anyway, that's the interdependence rhetoric. I've summarized it there on that slide, and I've also spoken a little bit about it. But again, you put that with the national security rhetoric, and you know, what Cohen and I are going to do now is they're going to see through this rhetoric, and they're going to find the truth that's in between these two things. So this is their answer. They says, look, you know, the interdependence rhetoric it's really only true if, you know, if the world economy or the ecological system was in real danger. Okay, so you have to accept that they're in real danger, and on top of that, you'd have to also imagine or agree that all nations were significantly vulnerable to such a disaster. And you know, similarly vulnerable. So you have to believe that too. So you'd have to think, you know, this is this ecological disaster. Right? It's not just going to affect, I don't know, Bangladesh, or it's not just going to affect, you know, the sort of southeast coast, the Gulf of Mexico, that coast of the United States, and then the Caribbean. No, it's not just going to affect that. It's going to affect the whole world pretty much the same, you'd have to believe. And then even if you took those two things and if you said, yeah, it's a real danger, and yes, everybody everywhere is going to have the same sort of problems, well, now the only thing, the extra thing that you would need is you'd have to believe that there's only one solution available. It's only under those circumstances, those three, that you would get cooperation, that it would demand cooperation, and the cooperation would be automatic. Other than that, you know, cooperation's not, we're not going to see cooperation, they're saying. So note this, right? Note that Cohen and Nye, you know, that they're liberals, they're trying to explain why there's no war, they suspect, right, that things aren't as bad as the realists are saying, but they're also rejecting the sort of more modern, like, oh, we're all interconnected, we're all interdependent, and so we'll all start to work together for some more you know, uncommon interest, that things that affect us all, like the environment, right, or perhaps like the world economy. We all want to prosper, and so we're going to work together. And they're saying, like, no, that's unlikely. That's an unlikely scenario. These three things, I think Cohen and I think, are unlikely to all be true at the same time, and maybe none of them might be true for Cohen and I. So conflict does not go away even when interdependence prevails. There's just a new form of conflict. So a quick sort of analysis, I guess, for me is Cohen and Nye, they don't think that the realists, the traditionalists, they don't think that they're right. They don't think it's all about balance of power. They don't think it's all about the material capabilities and the distribution of material capabilities in the system. They reject that. They say, no, that's not it. There's just something else. Something has changed. Something is different, right? We do have this interdependence, but that interdependence is not going to lead to cooperation. it's going to lead to a different sort of conflict. And so, yeah, we should adjust our theories to account for that, but that we shouldn't adjust our theories, but we still need a theory about conflict and war, because we're still going to see conflict and war. And so now they want to talk about interdependence. What is it? Right? They want to measure it. I've written there as the title, interdependence as an analytic concept. They want to be very, I guess, scientific, we should say. Like positivist. I think we've spoken about positivism, I think, when we talked about theorizing in international politics. They want to have a fairly concrete concept of interdependence that they can then measure and test. And that's what they do in their book, which you can read the full amount of the book. Incidentally, like if you just want this stuff that I'm sort of giving in maybe more detail, in the words of Cohen and I, if you just read the first few chapters, later on is when they start getting more into the application and the actual measurement of interdependence, which is also interesting, but anyway, it's up to you. Interdependence is an analytic concept. And so, situations characterized by reciprocal effects among countries or among actors in different countries. Okay, so that's what interdependence is. We're looking for situations, right? We're looking for events where when something happens here in this country, something over there in that other country also happens as a result. Right? These reciprocal effects. It doesn't have to be the same thing in both countries, but one thing here has to cause something else over there. Right, that's the beginning. The second thing is this: it's interconnectedness and interdependence are two different things. All right, so be careful with that for if you're going to write a paper or something. Right, be careful to be precise with these words. Right, interconnected. That's maybe the internet. Right, the internet connects us all to everybody else. Right, and the fact is, I can see videos that have been made in Greece, and I sometimes watch those. I can watch the news in Greek. So I can see those things and I have access to them. And so we're connected. I'm connected to the Greek news, I guess. But that on its own doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't affect international politics. The example that they use, because they're not really thinking about the internet in 1977, but they're saying, yes, we maybe import furs and jewelry and perfume, and we trade that. And if there was a war, those things would stop. But the thing is, we don't really need those things, they say. Right? Those things they're luxuries, they're not necessities. And so the fact that we rely on, I don't think we import furs from anywhere anymore, right? And probably in the United States, we don't need to import furs if we did. But if that supply got cut off, we could be fine without those things. Life would go on. We'd figure out another way to clothe ourselves, to keep ourselves warm in the winter. So that's interconnectedness as well, right? We're interconnected in that we watch movies from other countries, we watch TV shows on Netflix, right there, from that are produced in different countries, and we have all this interconnectedness, but we can live without those things. So that doesn't make us dependent, right? We can watch Squid Games, for example. I haven't actually watched it, but I know it's been popular. We could watch that. And it's from South Korea, and if there was ever some sort of a war that prevented, either we were at war with South Korea, which was unlikely, but some sort of the conflict makes it impossible or more expensive, right, to sort of beam those sorts of shows across, to create them in South Korea and then to beam them across. Well, I don't think they get beamed across, but you know what I mean. If it ever became more expensive, then that would be fine. We would carry on with our lives and we watch just different shows, right? Or we'd watch the old shows that we already have saved on Netflix or whatever, on the service. So, but oil is different. Like the United States is actually a net exporter of oil now, but if you're Japan in particular, right, you rely on imports of oil. If there's a war that cuts off that supply, you're in serious bother now, right? And that's interdependent because, well, everything that runs on oil, almost everything. And so not having access to that would be a serious problem. It would be different than not having access to perfume. And so that's the difference between interdependence and interconnectedness. I just merged both of the words together there, if you noticed. So More broadly, then I've given you some examples, but more broadly, interdependence exists where there are reciprocal costly effects, right? So the effects have to be costly. The price of, let's say, a bunch of oil fields catch fire in Iraq, right? Well, that causes an increase in the price of petrol in Japan, right? Probably all over the world, right? Western Europe, North America. And those effects might be quite costly to the economy. They might be costly in other ways too, right? What if I don't know, let's say Germany, from a national security perspective, right, couldn't get its hands on enough fuel for its military vehicles, right? Well, that's now a serious military threat to Germany, right? And so it's a costly effect. It's a reciprocal effect because something happened in the Middle East, in Iraq, or maybe Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or something, Qatar, that then affected another country somewhere else in such a way that was costly, and that, yeah. Note then that interdependence, it's not necessarily mutually beneficial. Like, it might be just that one country depends on the other country. I suppose this makes me think of Chile. I remember this is in some ways it's a fun example, but it's, there's some level of seriousness to it. Britain, I think we said in another lecture, it relies on food imports. It can't feed itself, and part of that is there's not enough to feed everybody that lives in Britain from the land that's in Britain. But secondarily is that there's only so many things that grow there. So if you want a variety of fruits and vegetables, you've got to import quite a lot of the fruits and vegetables. And so Chile, I guess, is a place, I don't know about these days, but certainly 10, 15 years ago when this was a news story, it was the case that a lot of Britain's fruits and vegetables were coming from Chile. And there was some sort of trade dispute, right, between Britain and Chile. And the Chilean, I can't remember which minister it was, some member of the Chilean government was being interviewed about it. What said something, the interview said, what impact is this having on the Chilean economy? And the minister said, well, I'm sure we're going to get this resolved soon. He says, we can't let the British go without fruits and vegetables. And it's what he was saying there, in a sort of a lighthearted way to some extent, but what he was saying is that, like, he was claiming this sort of unidirectional dependence. It's like, look, Britain depends on us for these fruits and vegetables, for food, right? And the amount of money perhaps that they pay for it, it's, perhaps it's not going to break the Chilean economy if we don't get it, but they can't live without their food, right? So whether it's true or not, right, you might say, well, no, they're really, really worried about the economic effects. It's like, well, you can argue about that, but at least the impression that government minister was trying to give was that, no, you depend on us more than we depend on you. This food is worth more to you than the money that you give us is worth to us, right? And that's a whether it's true in that case or not, like, it is true in some cases, right? It's true in some relationships that some countries need the other countries more than the opposite. So interdependence, it might not be mutually beneficial, right? It might be all in one country's favor. You can think about China and the manufacturing base in China and how it produces a lot of the finished goods that we consume in the United States, right, and across the world. And you can sort of look at that and say, well, we're interdependent. To whose benefit is this? And there's some people that would say, well, this is good for China, right, because they're developing this big industrial base and they're taking a lot of money, right, and they're developing, right, and some people say, well, no, they're taking advantage of the United States, right, and they're getting rich at our expense, and they're manipulating the price of the currency, and then but then some people might say the opposite, that, like, the United States is benefiting, right? They're getting these very cheap goods that they, and now all these Americans have everything that they ever can dream of. They can afford it, to buy everything they've ever wanted, and they're sort of exploiting these poor Chinese workers, right? So So, you know, it's debatable which side is more dependent on the other, but that's the point that Cohen and I want to make is that interdependence might only benefit one. It doesn't necessarily have to benefit both sides. And that these interdependent relationships always involve costs. Interdependence restricts autonomy, and it's impossible to tell. This is interesting considering what we talked about at the end of realism, when we talked about sort of rational reasons for war. But Cohen and I claim that it's impossible to tell a priori from the beginning, right, at the start, whether the benefits of the relationship will exceed the costs. So going back to our example of Britain and Chile, so, you know, we start off on this trade relationship where we send them money and they send us fresh fruits and vegetables, right, that they can grow in Chile that we can't grow in England. And, you know, it looks like, okay, well, there's some benefit there, but we don't know what the costs are until we start the relationship, or we don't know all of the costs and all the benefits. And so what they're doing here is they're sort of setting up this scenario where, yes, we're all in these interdependent relationships, but we don't know who's benefiting and who's not benefiting. And we don't know for sure, like if we look at a particular relationship between two or more countries, we don't know if the benefits of that relationship are exceeding the costs even, right? So it's a bit of a scary situation to be in if you're Cohen and I. There's a lot of things that you don't know, which makes it hard to be a rational actor, right? Which is an interesting, I think, critique of Cohen and I. Anyway, one thing that we talked about before, I believe we talked about relative versus absolute gains, right? For realists, it's all about the relative gains. And the neoliberals here, Cohen and I, are throwing the realists a bone here. They say, you know, classical economists, when they look at trade, they're looking at absolute benefits, and they're saying, yeah, if Chile and the United Kingdom, if they trade, they'll both be better off, because now the United Kingdom won't have to try and, you know, won't have to make pathetic attempts to grow, I don't know, what do they grow in Chile? I can't remember what the fruits and vegetables in question were now, but like, let's say peppers or something like that, like bell peppers. I don't know if that's something that grow. I think you need some warmth for that, right? You don't get much of those in England, I don't think. Anyway, you know, so maybe they're growing those over there, and you know, maybe the fact that now Britain doesn't have to try and grow those and fail, or like try and grow some sort of substitute that wouldn't be as good, and they can just pay Chile to do it instead. And so then it's sort of, there's an absolute benefit coming out of that trade, but the relative gains, say the liberals, are still important. And the reason the relative gains are important is because if you have this unequal dependence, if one person's gaining more than the other person's gaining, that can be a source of power. Because then the one that's getting less out of the relationship can say, okay, well, we want a little bit more, otherwise we're going to stop, we're going to end the relationship. Right, and now you're sort of always getting in a worse and worse position, a weaker and weaker and weaker position, because the guy up here, let's say it's the Chileans in this case, let's say, you know, they can just say, well, we'll stop sending you the fruit and vegetables if you don't pay us more money. You know, I guess at some point, right, the money that you send gets to the point where it's not worth it anymore. But yeah. I think the most important thing from here is just that if we're looking at power, as we did with realism, we looked at power and we looked at sort of armies and navies, and we talked about Mearsheimer, we looked at land forces. That's the source of power. Well, Cohen and I want to add this other sort of power, which is sort of unequal dependence is a source of power. And they say, well, what's power? It's an ability to get one actor to get another actor to do something it wouldn't otherwise have done. Think about that for just a few seconds at least, that, you know, power can be quite hard to measure, and especially the way that they've defined it here, because they're sort of defining it by outcomes. But sometimes it's hard to exactly sort of pinpoint, well, why did they do that thing? Like if I came to you and says, here, take this $100, and you took the $100, and I said, ha, I exercise power over you by making you take $100. It's like, well, okay, I guess in a way, right, you controlled the outcome there, right? You wanted me to take the $100, but honestly, that's, yeah, of course I'm going to take your $100 every single time. Why not? That's a bit good for me. So, I don't. So that's not power. It's it's to make them do something they wouldn't otherwise have done. And even that, part of why I'm talking about this is I took this graduate class with Professor Ball talking about, well, a big part of the class was talking about power, right? And this is sort of the second most sophisticated definition of power that we discussed. And of course, it goes on after that to much more, power, like to start to think about power and to get people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise have done. And then you have to think, well, how did you get the idea to make them do that thing, right? And then maybe they give you that idea or something, or maybe they somehow set the agenda in such a way that you exercise that power that you had in order to make them do something they otherwise wouldn't have done. But but I guess what I'm saying is there's also structures of power in which actors live that sort of define what is in each of their interests, and sometimes it's the structures that are deciding what's in both of the interests. And so the thing that you wouldn't have done might have been, you might not have done it because of the way that the structure's structured, and then who was involved in setting up that structure, right? So anyway, it can get quite complicated, as you can imagine, but this is relatively uncomplicated in some ways. But anyway, this is their definition of power, and so, but their argument basically is that the asymmetric interdependence. If I need you more than you need me, that gives you a certain amount of power, right? And you could get me to do things that I might not otherwise have done because of the relationship we have and the necessity, the dependence I have on you. And so it's not. Oftentimes that power that you might have from that relationship, right, it's translated into effects by political bargaining, rather than by sort of threats of force. Like, you're not threatening to do any sort of violence against me. That's not what it is. It's not that you might not even be sort of bigger and stronger than me. It's possible, but the fact that I need something that you're providing, that sets up this asymmetric interdependence. That ends up, when we get into any sort of political bargains, right? That's there as a source of power, and as a way to sort of steer that bargaining towards things that you want. So anyway, it's another source of power, I'd say. And then here's sort of two different types of interdependence. Now that Cohen and Nye talk about two different types. One is sensitivity and one is vulnerability. So sensitivity interdependence means that, like, a country might have to enact new policies to deal with actions originating with other actors. So this is the oil crisis. Japan was more affected than the United States, but this is the thing. So the United States might be able to. Well, they have other options. What they could do is they could use their own oil reserves, right? The United States has massive oil reserves, and so during the oil crisis, the United States has a choice. Now, they're still sensitive to the oil crisis. They still now have to make a decision, and the decision is like pay extra for oil or start tapping our own oil reserves. And so that, and maybe they switch to using their own oil reserves, and that's not nothing, right? Because now something that's happened in the Middle East has caused the United States to change its policy in a fairly serious way. So the United States is sensitive to that, but Japan was beyond sensitive, right? It was vulnerable because Japan doesn't have its own source of oil. So if it can't get oil from the Middle East, it's in a real bind. Now you might say, well, they could look elsewhere in the world for oil, but that's the sort of line in terms of where you draw the line between sensitivity and vulnerability. Is like, is there a realistic policy alternative or not, right? And if there's not a realistic policy alternative, you're vulnerable. If there is a realistic policy alternative, then you still might be sensitive because now you have to adjust your policy. But but it's not the same as being vulnerable. Streaking was an interesting one that was in the book. I'm not sure why I put it on the slide. It's sort of to illustrate the same thing. There's this social factor where I guess people were doing it in the US and sort of spread to Europe. And again, I guess it sort of goes back to the idea as well of interconnectedness. It's like, well, there's ways that Britain can sort of change its laws and police in different ways in order to, prevent it. It can change its policies. But I guess it's not just economic things that go backwards and forwards, it's also social factors as well. I think that's the added benefit of talking about streaking, right? Is that there's also social factors as well as economic ones like oil. Vulnerability. So I think we've done this. Consider a shift in oil prices. If two countries import the same proportion of their oil, but one can shift to domestic production, then they're not both as vulnerable. Right? What alternatives exist? We've done it. It's the difference between sensitivity and vulnerability. For Cohen and Nye, vulnerability is much more relevant than sensitivity. Yeah. If you can find a replacement, and this, remember, we had this discussion as well when we talked about Mearsheimer and we talked about blockading. Countries can usually find another way around. They can either invent something new, like a synthetic alternative to a natural import, or they can just recycle, or they can use less of something. And so where that's possible, then you might be sensitive, but you might not be vulnerable. So conclusions. I've made this conclusion, I think, 2 or 3 times now, but let me make it again. Asymmetrical interdependencies, right, where one's benefiting, one's more dependent than the other. Well, that's a source of power. It can be used by states as well as transnational actors. We haven't talked a lot about transnational actors, things like multinational corporations and that sort of thing. But we're going to focus on states in this course. So states can use asymmetrical interdependencies as sources of power. Power from sensitivity interdependence is limited to situations where policy change is unacceptably costly, which I think we've gone over in the last slide, right? The idea that vulnerability, you can't do anything about it, right? That's serious. Even sensitivity, maybe policy change is very costly, right? And then that's still relevant, right? And it's an element of power, but that other countries can use against you. Britain being sort of short of food, that's, there are policy changes that you can make. And one of the policy changes that you can make is rationing. And Britain did that during the Second World War. They rationed the food. And that's, to an extent, that's a fairly costly policy now, because you're saying, look, you can't eat the food that you want. You can't buy the food that you want. The stores are not going to sell it to you. You have to only have, 3 eggs a week or something like that. Well, how costly is that? That might be considered quite costly, but of course Britain did pay that cost and fought the Second World War, successfully by all accounts. So yeah. If a state chafes at its economic vulnerabilities, it might resort to military power. Yeah. And that again goes back to Mearsheimer, right? So there's elements here of realism. Of course, this book is written before Mearsheimer's book that we read, but of course, Mearsheimer was not making all this stuff up. He's getting it from realism. He's not making it all up in 2001. But the idea here, right, is like, hey, if I'm so economically vulnerable, let's say if I have no access to oil and I've got a certain amount of oil left, and then it's all gone and I have no way of getting more. Well, one option might be, right, well, where is the oil? Where does it live? And let me get there and let me take some control of it in some way, maybe militarily, right? And so interdependence, it doesn't cause cooperation and doesn't necessarily lead to peace. It just leads to different sorts of conflict. And it can be itself a source of conflict, military conflict and political conflict for sure. And so it's again, this is liberalism. This is Cohen and Nye, it's interdependence, but it's not the same as the interdependence rhetoric that says, oh, we can't go to war, we can't fight, we can't be in conflict anymore because we're all too tied together, we're all too interconnected. We've moved away from that now.